Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we're back with another innovator interview. You know, there are about 30 million small businesses in the United States, and every one of them carries a carbon footprint. While a lot of large companies have made many statements about reducing their carbon emissions and environmental impact, and even a few have actually taken genuine action, most small businesses continue to sit on the sidelines in the climate crisis. So we're talking today with Cooper Wechkin, who's the founder and CEO of RyeStrategy. They provide carbon auditing and neutrality planning for small businesses. And it's a service that starts at around $2,000 for companies with 1 to 9 employees and ranges up to more than $10,000 for firms with more than 150 employees. But if you are a small business and you want to make a difference, you need to measure your carbon footprint first and have a plan in order to reduce it. So RyeStrategy got our attention with a call for small businesses to sign a carbon neutrality pledge. It was kind of a marketing campaign, but it worked. It got our attention. And they're working to bring companies together to join this mission to create a much larger impact across the small business sector. We wanted to have a conversation with Cooper about the reasons a small business needs to pursue carbon neutrality, how to do it effectively, and what the benefits are when interacting both with their customers and their employees. You can follow RyeStrategy at ryestrategy.com. That's RYE strategy.com. And welcome to the show, Cooper. How are you this morning?
Thanks, Mitch. I'm doing well and glad to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. First off, tell us what your carbon neutrality pledge requires of somebody who signs it. Is it a statement of intent, or do you require some specific actions, and in what time frame?
Yeah, so I would say it's a statement of intent with specific actions backing it. So we have 4 kind of different components that we're looking at. And the first is transparent carbon neutrality by 2022. And I'd be happy to elaborate a little bit further on what that actually entails and what that looks like. The second component is reporting that to our team before December 31st of 2022. For our record, just so we can keep track and make sure that everyone's meeting the pledges that they're making. There's also public listing on our neutrality pledge page. So that's either as carbon neutral, if you've already achieved it, or pledged carbon neutral. And then there's biannual check-ins from our team until carbon neutrality is achieved. So it's a pretty light commitment in terms of the actual things that we're expecting out of companies and the interactions that we have there. The biggest part really being that achievement of transparent carbon neutrality by the end of 2022.
Are there consequences if somebody signs up and doesn't act? I mean, do you knock them later? What happens?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And that's one that we definitely bounced around a lot of different ideas on. Currently, there are no legal obligations or any direct penalties that go into it because, again, at the end of the day, we want to make this information as accessible as possible for businesses and organizations. But that being said, it will be publicly listed who met and didn't meet the pledge requirements at the end of 2022. So that information is going to be publicly available. Those who did meet those goals will be celebrated and that information will be presented, and the people who weren't able to make that will also be publicized on that website. And again, it's not the end of the world if it doesn't quite work out for a company, but we do really want to have some form of accountability there. And again, we really just want to help as many organizations as possible to achieve that goal and hopefully make that big difference at the end of the day.
So let's talk about carbon transparency, because that's a challenge for large companies. First to collect the information and then to actually make it comprehensible to people. So what does that mean when you talk about a small business being carbon transparent?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're really looking at is following an internationally accepted method for actually accounting for the greenhouse gases that a business creates. So right now, that's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It was created by, I think it was the WRI, and I'm drawing a blank on the second organization, but it's been around for a long time. And basically what that looks like is breaking down a company's footprint into what they call scopes. So there are 3 different scopes to look at. Scope 1 is the direct emissions that come from burning fossil fuels on site. There are a few other things that kind of get factored in there. Refrigerants that are leaked get counted. Scope 2 is the energy usage that a company has. And then Scope 3 is basically everything else. And there are 15 subcategories that go into it. For the sake of time and keeping people interested, I won't list them all out. But just for some examples there, we're looking at let's say the energy usage that comes with using a company's product. So what's the impact that the customer has using company's product? What are the impacts of the purchases that the company is making, about the transportation that it kind of necessitates by buying physical goods and having them shipped to their offices? So we're really looking at everything else that kind of gets factored in there. And so when we're looking at transparent carbon neutrality, I would say that there's kind of two key components we want. One is that a company really reports what is that total amount? What are the amounts that they had under the different scopes? And then on the other end, to go carbon neutral, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more, sure, there has to be some form of offset at the end of the day. In a perfect world, we would all have business models where purely by adopting some technology or other, we don't have to worry at all about the emissions we create, but that's not quite the world we live in yet. So on the other end of it is really figuring out what investments does a company have to make to really bring down that footprint at the end of the day. So if that's planting trees, how much money do they have to invest in trees that are going to sequester an equivalent amount of carbon they emitted during a certain year? And so with that kind of transparency side, we want those numbers to be clearly communicated. And on the other end, we want to make sure that for those offsets, that the offsets that they inevitably have to purchase, that those are verified offsets. So they're really sequestering the carbon, rather than just paying some guy in his basement, instead of really making that difference.
Yeah, just there are people out there who are just asking you to pay them so you feel good, but you want an audited sequestration program.
Exactly.
Just as your books audited.
Yep, exactly. I mean, you want to make a difference that really matters because, again, at the end of the day, I think there are a lot of benefits that come with claiming to be carbon neutral that goes beyond just actually being carbon neutral. But the very root of this is being carbon neutral and making that difference, and really balancing out what those emissions are at the end of the day.
So are the carbon footprints of a small company, let's say 5 to 10 employees, are they highly variable? Obviously, lots of companies have different business models that go into different dimensions of carbon emission. Is there an average footprint size for a company that's of that size?
Yeah, so I guess I can speak from personal experience there. It definitely does depend, and that's the cop-out answer. But it really does depend, and more so than the number of employees, it's really determined by how much business a company is doing and what kind of business it's doing. So that's really, again, kind of the purchases that it's making, and then the number of customers that it's serving, as well as how it serves them. So as a result, you might see an organization that has just 5 to 10 employees, but they have a larger footprint than a company with 80 employees. And that could be purely based on how many customers they're serving and, again, kind of how it serves them. And so I think a good example of that is if you took a manufacturing company, there's going to be a lot of transportation. There's going to be emissions from actually manufacturing a product versus, let's say, a remote consulting practice like ours. Again, we're not quite near 80 people yet, more so in that 5 to 10 employee range. But if you were to take a remote consulting practice, those are people who are working from home, and there are emissions associated there, but it's going to be a lot less than anything that has that physical component with more fossil fuels being burned. So again, it really is just going to depend on what a business is doing. But that being said, in our experience, we've worked with a lot of software organizations. You can expect an average footprint of approximately 10 to 20 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per employee. So that'd be about anywhere from 50 to 200 metric tons of CO2 emitted per year for a company in that kind of size range, and it falls into the software category.
So it sounds like the most accurate way to discuss this would be in terms of the ratio of emissions to revenue. Is that a good way to think about this? Could you compare one's company to others by looking at how much CO2 you're emitting per dollar revenue?
Yeah, and so they call it's carbon intensity. I think it's a great metric. To be honest, it's one of those ones that's sometimes a little bit harder to look at. Just purely based on that transparency component, it can be a bit easier to figure out for a privately owned company what their revenue is. So I think that information is a little bit less available as opposed to the overall footprint and number of companies. But that being said, it absolutely is a great metric to be able to look at. Although again, you could have an organization that made $5 million, purely off of phone calls, and you could have an organization that made $5 million, manufacturing a product, and the footprint there would still be pretty different at the end of the day.
Sure. So let's say somebody picks up the phone and they talk with you. What's the first conversation between a small business and RyeStrategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first conversation is really just figuring out what is carbon neutrality, which I think is probably a great time at this point for me to address. And that's essentially, again, figuring out what is that footprint, and then how can you reduce it and offset it at the end of the day. And so what we're really going over on that first phone call is just seeing getting that information communicated out there, really communicating what the benefits are at the end of the day of going through that process, and then seeing if it's a good fit for an organization. I think at the end of the day, of course, we want everyone to be on board with doing this, whether that's with our services, someone else's services. We'd love it if it's possible to really have companies learn how to do it on their own as well. Again, this is just one of those things that's pretty important for all of our futures here. So, we really just want to see if it's the right fit. And if it is, then we hopefully take that next step of starting that process. And then from there, take them through the process of going carbon neutral and really figuring out how to benefit from that at the end of the day while making a genuine impact.
So once a business has a good carbon footprint analysis in hand, what are the first steps? What are 5 things that you would recommend that they do to make an immediate difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in terms of 5 kind of immediate things, I'd want to look at solutions that are relatively easy to implement, particularly given that we've all been working from home for over a year now, which is a little bit crazy to think about. I would say that a really large thing that we see is commuting to work. And again, I'm thinking about ideas that are realistically implementable at this point with so many companies now making that decision of whether they're going back to the office or not. Yeah. Commuting to work is one of those things that it makes that impact, right? That's extra driving that if you slept in a little bit longer in the morning or just started working in the morning, the electricity that you'd use to do the extra work wouldn't come anywhere near the gas that's getting burned to get you to the office. So I would say that if we're looking at reducing that footprint, that's one strategy that we can look at is kind of cutting back on that commuting to work. Another one is flying for work. Again, I think that's something that we've seen a massive reduction in this past year. And a lot of companies are really considering whether or not they need to do that anymore. We're on a Zoom call right now, and I think it turns out that for a lot of companies that's more than sufficient. That's another major emitter. I think if I'm remembering correctly here, the airline industry accounts for 2% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So where companies are able to cut back there, absolutely something we'd recommend. Another key one is switching to renewable energies. So there are renewable energy credits out there. Those recently have been coming under a bit of scrutiny. So I think the more preferable option is switching directly through your utilities provider to a more renewable energy source. And that, again, is really going to, if we're looking at it from a carbon footprint perspective, that would lower your scope 2 numbers at the end of the day. And then I think just a couple other strategies we'd recommend. Again, we have a bit of a background with SaaS companies in particular. So choosing more eco-friendly server providers for any organizations that are enabled by those. So Google has been carbon neutral since 2007. If you actually go to google.com on your laptop or on your computer, you'll see it right at the bottom in the middle part of the page, and you can read a little bit more about it there. So we're a big fan of them, as well as Microsoft is working towards being carbon neutral, and they're actually building out a calculator currently to help organizations figure out those server emissions, which again, for a software organization ends up being a pretty large part of the footprint. And then I would just say,
more than you would think.
It's interesting. I was actually doing a little bit of reading earlier this week, and I just mentioned the airlines that account for 2% of our emissions. And it turns out that the data centers are roughly equivalent in terms of annual emissions. So they're huge usages of energy. And again, there's some emissions that are inevitable, and we're not here to tell businesses not to be who they are, to not do what they do. But again, we want to figure out how we can help them to reduce the impacts that they have and then offset the rest. And so I would say kind of the last component there is for almost any business, you're going to be looking at service providers and making those purchases. So really just purchasing from service providers who are already transparently carbon neutral, as we talked about before. That can be a great way to kind of limit that impact after figuring out what your initial footprint is.
So you're describing trade-offs, lots of trade-offs. And let's use the airlines versus data center example, because they are roughly equivalent in terms of their impact. If I'm sitting here thinking about traveling for business today, I'm probably going to say, let's do a Zoom call. But a lot of people rationalize the need to travel, say, for instance, to a trade show because they want to get together with other people. The flight isn't the only component in that footprint. There's also the whole footprint of the trade show and all the stuff being moved into the trade show venue and then back out, and all the people moving in and out of it and so forth. So when you think about those kinds of complex scenarios in which you have to make a decision about a trade-off, what are the what are the benefits of physical presence that you would say this is worthwhile for you to fly? Do you have that kind of advice available for somebody who asks?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would answer that more from a personal level. Unfortunately, that's not something that directly falls under our services.
And every business is going to have to do the same. Sure.
Right. Right. And so, I mean, I think that's a question to really ask at an individual employee level, at an organizational level at the end of the day, because again, those are going to be the people who really know the business. I would say again, like we are able to do these Zoom calls and make it work. And there is definitely some legitimacy to meeting in person. And I'll be honest, I love working with people in person. But you know, at the end of the day, if it's not a necessary flight, if it's something that can be done over video call and make that difference, then, you know, like you said, I mean, there's the emissions that come from the event itself. There's also the emissions from staying in a hotel, from all the Ubers you're going to take or Lyft, whatever your preference is there. You know, there are a lot of different things that really go into that. So I think it's one of those decisions where at the executive level, companies should hopefully be looking into it and deciding what is really essential. And then at the individual employee level, going through that same process and figuring out what makes sense. And I mean, I think the great part about this is that a lot of what is going to reduce carbon is also going to cut costs, which almost any business is going to want to do. So if you come back and fight to save money.
So being aware of the carbon footprint is also a way to think about your overall cost. It's an interesting connection.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's one of those things that really gives it a strong case, is that when we look at your carbon footprint, it's just a different way of looking at your business's operations. And of course, there's not a direct correlation, as we mentioned earlier, between dollar figures and CO2 emissions. But again, it's that general idea that if you're able to cut back on things, you'll be able to save on your carbon footprint and also on your costs at the end of the day.
So at the outset, you mentioned carbon offsets as part of the strategy. At the end of the day, we do have to sequester some carbon because nobody's doing it. Now, critics say that enables companies to rationalize continuing to emit carbon. What's your advice, and how do you see us moving past that criticism to a more complete understanding of how we are collectively making reductions in our society's footprint?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier, given the current technological landscape, and also, let's be honest, the relevant nascency of carbon neutrality as a commonly accepted practice for organizations, I personally think it's nearly inevitable that the companies will continue to emit carbon in the short run. And obviously, that's not ideal. But again, I think we want to be able to work with what we have. And again, hopefully work towards that long run goal of not needing offsets and really just having carbon neutral practices. So that being said, I think carbon offsets are an excellent intermediary solution. It provides businesses with an immediate solution to their impact. It also opens the door to them fully adopting carbon neutral practices in the future as technologies continue to develop. And I think the way that I've always seen it is that if we ask companies today to fully adopt carbon neutral practices immediately without any assistance from offsets, I think it's unlikely we'd see much traction there at the end of the day. I think that would be a really, really large ask, just given where the technology is at currently. So offsets definitely aren't a perfect solution, but I think they are a good kind of entry solution as we figure out the technology to live a carbon-free future. And they're a way to really balance what's happening now while also getting companies on board with this idea moving forward. So hopefully it's one of those things that you've been offsetting your footprint for 5 to 10 years, and now suddenly there's this green technology that's going to make it that much easier to lower your footprint. I think it's a lot more likely that we're going to see companies adopting that if they're already familiar with being carbon neutral and going through this process. And if anything, as that technology develops, carbon offsets do cost money. And so if those technologies become cheaper, then I think it's a great way to really get companies on board upfront with this. And then hopefully as we get that technology, then we can start to work towards that carbon-free future.
So by mapping carbon onto your business and thinking about it from a cost perspective, once you start to offset instead of emit, you've made reductions. Now the offsets are one of the costs you're trying to reduce. And
exactly.
So you're focused on actually investing in the green technology that resolves that issue.
Exactly. And again, I think it's it's a little bit easier to go in and say, okay, I'm going to spend $5,000 this year to offset my footprint than it is that I'm going to go out and I'm going to research this new technology that's still developing. I'm going to invest this much money and everything else. I think it's one of those good solutions to address the problem up front while also keeping the door open to a more permanent solution in the long run. But I would say with that, though, I would caution listeners just to be careful with the offsets that they do purchase.
That's my next question is, what do I look
perfect.
for when I make a carbon offset purchase? What should I be looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we really want to keep an eye out for are either the gold standard or the verified carbon standard. I think it's called Vera now. And those are basically third-party organizations which go in and they verify an offset project, its legitimacy. So they ensure that the projects are properly sequestering carbon rather than just shifting it elsewhere. And I would say that's the biggest thing that we want to find is that if you're looking at offsets and there are some out there, and there's been a lot of this in the media, is that there are offsets that are not legitimate. And so I think with offsets in particular, more so than with footprinting or any other component, you really want to make sure that investment at the end of the day is being made in the right place and into projects that are sequestering carbon, rather than just shifting it elsewhere or at the worst case doing nothing. But I would say that those two, the gold standard and the verified carbon standard Vera, that those are currently the industry leading verification practices that are out there.
So these third-party validations are important to your customers and your employees believing that you're actually doing it. So what's your advice about making sustainability claims once you've decided to embrace the journey to carbon neutrality? Do you encourage companies to take a stand and say, we're getting there, or do you suggest that they rely on third parties to validate and sort of step back and let the consumer or the employee find out for themselves?
Yeah, I would encourage kind of a mix there. So taking a stand and when possible, validating the steps as well. I'll be telling us a big reason that we got started is it is incredibly expensive to not only get carbon neutrality services, or more specifically carbon footprinting services, but also to have those validated at the end of the day. So that was our kind of founding mechanism there, is that if you look at it as a spectrum, you have on one extreme end, you have the consultancies that are serving Microsoft and charging hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and they're getting all these different validations. And on the right side, you have the DIY calculators. Mm-hmm. And so we really wanted to meet that middle ground to provide a more affordable service that can be as accurate as it can be, but also doesn't cost the major expenses that getting the full-on validation and having those larger companies working with you would cost. And so I, again, would encourage companies to take a stand and when possible to validate their steps. I think a really easy way to do that is that with carbon neutrality in particular, again, it is going to take some offsets and really just making sure that those offsets are validated. That's a cost that purchasers won't have to absorb. That's something that is already going to be accounted for if that offset's for sale. Offsets roughly tend to sell for between, I'd say, $7 and $15 per metric ton of CO2 emitted. So I think that's a really great way to have the steps validated, is to actually be purchasing those legitimate offsets. But given the emphasis that today's consumers are putting on sustainability, I think it absolutely should be a primary feature in any company's messaging. But I would say almost more important than kind of that third-party side is, again, that it should be presented in a transparent and accountable manner, really just to earn that consumer trust and also ensure that a genuine impact is being made.
So that's the next question is these sustainability-minded customers, and they are growing in number all the time. What are the consequences when they see through poorly executed sustainability efforts for the brand? What's your advice in terms of being able to back up your claims?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, only make a claim that you really can back up. I think it's a pretty obvious one, but it really does go a long way. And it's surprising to see some really major companies out there that make these claims that are obviously not true. And I think an example that comes to mind immediately is Shell, who, I personally see advertisements for it all the time, them claiming to be sustainable, but just, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, they just got court ordered by the Dutch government to drastically cut their emissions. So I think it's to make claims that are honest and to really, work towards being able to make claims that have an impact too, not just saying that you're sustainable, but doing something such as carbon neutrality to prove it. And so I think for those organizations that have clearly executed sustainability efforts poorly, of course, sales are likely to drop as consumers seek out more authentic and environmentally friendly organizations. And at the same time, employee satisfaction and therefore retention is likely to drop for similar reasons. So for the companies that do make those faulty claims, I think especially at that larger level, the consequences can be pretty dire.
So if one of our listeners is thinking, I want to call about my business or the company I work for, how do they get started with RyeStrategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can visit us online. Again, it's ryestrategy.com. And there's contact forms and everything else there. So always happy to get in touch. In terms of the services that we offer right now, our kind of bread and butter is that we got started to help small organizations that are essentially non-manufacturing. Again, like I mentioned earlier, once you get that manufacturing component, that footprint gets a lot larger, and it also just gets much more complicated how you take everything into account.
Yeah.
So for non-manufacturing businesses, we offer annual carbon footprinting services, a set of mitigation strategies to reduce that footprint year over year. And that varies from limiting travel to specific purchases that can be made to lower that impact. We offer custom offset portfolios with one of our 3 verified offset partners that we have currently. And then we also offer marketing consulting to really help organizations figure out how to pitch this correctly, how to do it in a way that's not greenwashing and that will keep the 81% of consumers in America that want businesses to be sustainable to make them happy and to match that need. For manufacturing organizations, we're currently in the process of building out a light offering. So again, we really want to be able to help as many organizations as we can. So that'll provide guidance on calculating your own carbon footprint, as well as a list of offset providers to choose from and a smaller set of mitigation strategies. And then for organizations that maybe aren't ready for the full footprint, but are still looking for a way to significantly lower their impact, we offer flight neutrality package as well, which calculates out emissions. We build out custom offset portfolios and then also identify a series of steps to be taken by executives and employees alike at all stages to lower the impacts of the travel journey. And then just the last component that we have currently is specialty sustainability consulting. So that's specific footprinting components such as employee commuting or flight emissions. We also do some design services for sustainability-oriented content and then certification research as well. So if any of those are appealing, we would always love to help out. And again, we can be found online at RyeStrategy. It's ryestrategy.com, and would love to help out however we can.
Well, Cooper, thanks for taking a few minutes to talk with us today.
Thank you so much, Mitch.
We've been talking with Cooper Wechkin. He's the founder of RyeStrategy, and you can find them at RyeStrategy.com, RyeStrategy.com. Folks, thanks for taking some time and spending it with me and sustainability in your ear. Please take a few minutes, too, to share this with your friends. We're only going to make changes in this world by working together, and we want to share more ideas to create less waste. We'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let us all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day. We'll be back soon.